Hi, and thank you for joining me in this video. I am so excited for you to be here. In this video, I'm going to be interviewing Andy Bell, who has recently released some documentation on his new CSS naming methodology, CUBE CSS. And I know what you're saying already. You're saying, Kevin, do we really need another way to name our CSS classes? If you know me, I'm a big fan of BEM, and it's something I've been using for a long time. It's something I've advocated for in my videos here for a long time. And as much as I loved it, there was always this nagging feeling as I was writing my CSS that I wasn't fully taking advantage of how CSS works. So there was a few things that I started doing a little bit differently. I never really followed them exactly. I was just really using it as a big influence on how I write my CSS. And then I came across Andy's post where he was talking about CUBE CSS. It's when he first let the world know about it. And I was scrolling down and reading it. And every line I read in that post, I fell more in love with the ideas he presented in it. It really spoke to me and spoke to how CSS maybe should be written. So in this video, we're going to be talking to Andy about why he created it and how he got around to creating it. We're going to be talking a little bit about our views just on CSS in general and the evolution of CSS. And then we're really going to take a deep dive into Cube and what the different pieces of Cube are and how it works and all of that. So there are a number of topics we do talk about. I'm going to have timestamps down below if you want to skip to any of the sections, if you're more interested in certain parts of this than other ones. It was a really fun chat that I had with Andy, and just in case you're wondering who he is an educator who focuses on design, front-end development, accessibility, and progressive enhancements, and is just a really smart guy overall. His blog posts and tutorials over at Piglily, as well as a new 11 course that he's just released. He also has Every Layout, which is a really cool CSS project that he's developed with Hayden Pickering. There'll be a whole bunch of links down below to all the stuff he's up to. This was a great chat. I'm so happy that Andy was willing to jump on. As soon as I read the post, I sent him an email. I needed to do this interview with him. So I'm so happy that he did agree to it. So let's jump right into it now. All right. So thanks so much, Andy, for being here for this. I'm really excited to dive into CUBE CSS.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
For me, my first introduction to CUBE CSS was when I found the blog post on it shortly after it came out. And as I was reading through it, I was sort of falling in love. Like every paragraph I read was just, this spoke so much to me and sort of how I sort of have been seeing CSS. And there's a few things with how I'd been writing it that sort of bugged me and how my own writing of it's been evolving. So I was so excited to see this. But I'm really curious because the whole idea, I personally use BEM, but I've sort of modified it a little bit on how I was using it. And the whole idea of sort of coming up with your own methodology, I'm guessing it wasn't just like an overnight thing. I'm curious how it came to be.
No, it's been a lot of years in the making as Cube. It's had a few different names as well over the years, but it's a good way to look at it. It's a bit like a fork of BEM. In a sense, like I did a lot of stuff with BEM, like a lot of stuff, and I actually do like BEM. I think BEM is what made me get really into CSS. Like I was always a fan of CSS, but systems and BEM just sort of really took an interest for me. I think quite a lot of people go from getting to the art side of CSS and the fancy side of it, but I was very much into, right, I want to write as little CSS as possible and build out as many cool design things as I can. And but yeah, the Cube thing has just been an evolution of lots of varied projects over the years that either pushed CSS really far, or BEM felt like it was taking a sledgehammer to crack an egg. So it's been trying to find a balance. That tends to be what I do in general, is try to find a balance between everything. And yeah, and that's how I ended up where I am with Cube, with this sort of weird little methodology that weirdly people seem to really like, which I didn't expect at all.
Yeah. I was going to say that the overall impressions of it, or it does seem to be, the reception of it so far has been pretty good.
Yeah, it's totally blown my mind. Like so the reason why I published that post originally was I was writing this course and CUBE CSS was really, really heavily featured in it. I thought, well, I need to explain what's going on, but I also don't want to interject with a 13-minute long lesson about the CSS methodology. So I thought, because quite a lot of people will just write whatever CSS you want to put in there, and I thought, well, some people might want to understand why the CSS is written like it is. So I drafted the post up and just published it, thinking it's cool, it's up there, it's live, it'll be there ready, and it just absolutely blew up completely. And yeah, it just blew my mind. It's just I write a lot of blogs, and it's just weird how some of the ones that you'll spend days and days and days crafting will get barely any views, and then you'll churn one out in an afternoon as a sort of, oops, I better do one of these,
Yeah.
and suddenly that one's just like all over the place. Yeah, yeah, it's just crazy, but it's good. I'm really glad people are sort of getting into it, because it gives me a bit of hope about the web a little bit, because like you were sort of alluding to there, a lot of CSS methodology work and CSS solutions now are going as really far away from the web and sort of treating the web as a compile target, whereas it's definitely not. And so it's just nice that something that is very webby is resonating with people.
Yeah, that actually leads really well to and the next thing is, what I wanted to say was just with a lot of the, I think, a lot of the other methodologies try and fix CSS. They see a problem with CSS. There's something wrong with it. And I think that's the thing that for me spoke to me the most is, you want to embrace how CSS works, the global scope of it, not being a problem, but actually being a feature, which so many seem to be trying to avoid. So I think that's, for me, that's at least what spoke to me about it. One of the other things that I noticed was that you talk a lot about progressive enhancements, minimum viable experiences, and I'm just, why for you is that so important, and especially to feature that so prominently in CUBE?
So progressive enhancements are a real big thing for me. And it comes from some work I used to do with the UK health system. So we've got the NHS in the UK. I worked on a product that the NHS used a lot. And the problem with the NHS is that they have a very, very old IT infrastructure. With no fault of their own, it's a sort of antiquated contract system in this country. And the problem with that was we wanted to be building these UIs for them, but they were using IE6 and stuff internally. And so we had to, we could have gone one of two ways. We could have said, right, we're going to build the best thing we could build, and then we're going to hack it to make it work. But then we were like, no, let's actually simplify our offering, what we're trying to achieve with the product, and then build a minimum viable experience, and then expand on it for more modern systems. So it meant that both the NHS could use it suitably, and also private practice could use it with their more modern systems and get the most out of it. So doing it like that really got me into progressive enhancement, and then working with like more global stuff. Connection speeds are shit, pardon my French, elsewhere, and the devices are really bad as well. Like we all see, I'm sat here talking to you on a sort of specced out MacBook Pro, and with an iPhone sat here, but really people are using really cheap hardware and really slow connections, and progressive enhancement really helps with that. Using HTML as your basis and CSS to enhance on that, and then finally JavaScript to enhance on that. It just provides a resilient experience for everyone, regardless, and it's just good.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's something, I sort of jumped on the CSS grid train really early on and had some videos on my YouTube channel about it. And a lot of people early on were like, "Why can't use it?" And I'm like, "Well, it's not, you can't. There's ways of getting it to work, and it doesn't have to, I've been championing that not everyone needs the exact same experience.
Yeah.
And it's, I'm already like, you have two people visiting your site. One's on a phone. They go home. They go on their desktop. The same user is getting a different experience. Why does every single person need, anyway? So that I really like how, the fact that you've made that an important part of it.
So it's quite funny you say that, because I've got this metric that I like to call time to what about IE11, which is like the time that it takes for you to tweet something cool about modern CSS to when some dude is in your reply saying, "But I can't use this because I've got to support IE11," as if they've got to produce like a pixel perfect solution. Yes. Yeah. And it is frustrating. I think one thing I recommend to like viewers is to read Resilient Web Design by Jeremy Keith, because like that was I remember reading that when he first released it, and I was already sort of embracing the web at the time, but that book really did sort of cement that methodology of progressive enhancement first, and building up and embracing the quirkiness of the web. And yeah, I think people would really benefit from.
Awesome. I'll make sure to leave a link down in the description for that.
Yeah, well, it's free as well, so awesome. It's a win-win.
Even better. So another thing, before we get into a bit of CUBE, another thing that really drew my attention that you mentioned was that you said that CSS is an extremely complex programming language, which I really appreciated.
Good.
A lot of people don't seem to see it that way, and it is something that I've written about before, where I say I think it's because CSS tricks us a little bit because the
Yeah.
syntax is so simple, and when you first start learning it, it's color blue, background black,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever it is, and I think people get tricked a little bit by that, but. You even went as far, well, yeah, you said it's in a complex programming language. So obviously, so a lot of people say it's not even a programming language. It's just a declarative language. So I don't know if you can expand on that at all.
Well, I mean, of course it is. It's providing instructions to computers, so it's a programming language by proxy of that. And it's that I'm glad you touched on what you said about what people learn about CSS and then what they drive an opinion out of. So quite a lot of people that will march around saying no, CSS is not a programming language, blah blah blah, and come up with some weird weak ass excuse about it. Usually you can almost guarantee that they've not got as far as even apply margin to an element with CSS. So their opinion of CSS is already pretty whack anyway. I think when you actually learn how CSS works, and that's what I was alluding to in the article, it's not the syntax of CSS is really easy, apart from grid, which for some reason I just cannot get it. I love grid, but by God, it just does not stick in my head, grid whatsoever. But everything else is really sort of straightforward, and like I'm a massive Flexbox fan, as you can probably imagine, with the every layout stuff, and the way that Flexbox works, especially, is just wizardry, and the way that these layout systems work, and the stuff that's coming in CSS as well, like it is mind-blowingly powerful. And the point I was trying to make in there is it's understanding how it works, which is the hard bit, because when you understand how it works, that's when you start writing simpler CSS, because you've sort of got more power at your hands because of that. And again, that's what I'm trying to do with this cube thing, is like writing less code, giving more power, and keeping things as simple as possible is a really beneficial. It really is. Now that we've got the tools available to us,
yes.
Cube would never have worked 5-10 years ago. No chance. We were fighting hard with CSS, but now with Flex and Grid and all these other amazing tools we've got, we're laughing with CSS. It's just incredible language now.
All right, so a lot of talk there, but let's get to what I wanted really to talk to you about, which is Cube itself. So just to break it down, it's Cube CSS. So we'll start with the C, which is composition, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So composition is a good way of looking at composition is it's a sort of skeletal area of the layout. So quite a lot of modern CSS methodologies and design system conversations really focus on small components, which is also what we should be doing for large projects. But the thing that often gets forgotten is how these small pieces fit together to create a larger composition. And this is essentially what we did with every layout was provide the tools to lay out whatever you could stick in it and it would work. And that's what the composition layer is you create these sort of layout systems with really baseline rules that hint the browser and say, look, if you can do this, lay out this element like that. Otherwise, pop a bit of margin between each of them and it's all good. It's sort of a nice flexible rule set. And then the idea is that you should be able to put whatever you want inside of each of these slots that you've created and it will just work. And that's the whole idea of composition, is it totally simplifies the relationship between your elements, because you create global rule sets to handle it, and within the components as well. So it's a sort of cascading, hence the C in CSS. You're using that principle of trying to reuse and inherit as much as you can as well. So yeah, that compositional layer should have no sort of visual stuff in it. It's essentially just layout and nothing else. Maybe a bit of spacing.
So next up in Cube would be the U, which would be for
utilities. So utility, and some people are probably quite aware of what utility does already if they've used stuff like Tailwind before. And the utility in Cube is the same. It's a class that does one job, and it does that one job well. So Usually it'll be applying a single property, so background color, a margin left value, something like that. But they can also be very small groups of component properties as well. So a good example is like a wrapper. So it'll have left and right auto margin, but then it might have some padding on the inside to give you a nice gutter, and then a max width on it. So that's a utility as well. It just does that one job and it does nothing else. Visually hidden, it'll hide things from us, from people who can see, but it'll announce it on a screen reader still. So it's just a utility that does that one job for you. And they are used a lot in this methodology. And you got to remember as well, by the time you get to utility, you've already styled lots of things with global CSS. You've then written compositional rules that will handle your layout for you. So when you get to the point of a utility, you're adding fine detail to your CSS. So you're implementing specific things to that specific context at that time.
Yeah, I like that you just mentioned that the first thing you're doing is writing your global CSS. I didn't sort of hint that at the beginning, but
yeah, it's progressive enhancement in practice as well. You're building up, and you're building up. The idea is then if your compositional styles and your utilities and then further on didn't load, your site would still look decent because you've got your global CSS in there. You know, and using semantic HTML anyway, then you're already off to a good start to start with. And then back into the utility stuff, there's in design systems, there's something called design tokens, which if you to distill it down, you're essentially what you've got. You might have colors, typography, all these sort of core design rules set externally to your code base, which is really common in design systems. They're not set in the CSS that you're working in. There might be all these sort of things happening. There might be in like a spreadsheet or a Figma file or something like that. There's an example I'm working on today for CUBE, some CUBE stuff that's coming up, where the design tokens live in Figma, and then the CSS takes those design tokens and uses them. And that's the key, is that they are also then translating to utility classes as well. So then you've got the background colors or typography being set with utilities, but then you've also should have access to those tokens at a global level as well. So you can set them in your global CSS. You can say background equals primary, you know, stuff like that. So it's creating this sort of cyclical approach to the CSS.
That's cool.
That's the utilities sorted, I think.
Yeah. And then, so after that, we have the block. And one thing that I think you mentioned it too, but with the block, it's, you know, when you look at something like BEM, that's where they're starting at. That's the first level. Whereas here you've sort of, okay, we've, you know, you're pushing in a way down.
Yeah, so it's deprioritized. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up as well, because like, I actually treat a block just like I do the BEM block in the past, but instead of like being scared of outer influence like you are with BEM, you try and do everything inside of a block with BEM. And it's an interesting way to think about how BEM is you build in a web with lots of little iframes, even though you're not using iframes. But the way that the CSS is written in BEM is it's very focused on that particular block. And that is not a sort of a bad thing, because I think in certain contexts, it is really useful to be able to do that, where you have little to no control over outside influence. Like BEM is really good. And that's where I've used it really successfully in the past, is where I've been working on systems that are absolutely bonkers and you have no idea where your component is going to end up. It's really useful to be able to like focus in. But I think those contexts are a lot less frequent these days than they were sort of 10 years ago, when the web was a bit more of a Wild West scenario. And so I now find that approach of blocks is not as helpful as it once was. And so now a block essentially in this CUBE methodology is, so you've got your global CSS, then you've got your composition, then you've got your utilities. By the time you get to a block, what you're doing at this point is saying, right, this card, for example, I want to set an aspect ratio for the image because I want it to be like a 16:9 aspect ratio. So I use that padding trick, 56.25%, job done. And then I've got a content area. And then what I'll do is I'll say, right, everything that's inside this content area, add a margin top to everything, every sibling element, using the lobotomized R selector. So again, that's composition inside of your block. And so it's setting specific rules for that specific context. And generally your block will be really small. it'll only be a little bit bigger than a utility class, essentially. But what it is it's a context or a namespace for specific stuff that happens inside of it. So that's where the similarities with BEM lie. And then, yeah, there's less things about elements then. It's more whatever goes on in here is fine because you've got that safety of the block class that's prefixes everything. And yeah, and the really simple blocks in this setup.
One thing I did notice with your blocks is you don't shy away from even suggesting to use like descendant selectors.
Yeah.
I know a lot of, and I've said it too, on trying to keep like a flat specificity. A lot of the time, just in large term, it can help prevent problems. But here, I guess the idea is that if you're doing it in a way that makes sense, it's okay to you raise it up a little bit.
Yeah, and that's it. And the thing with the block as well, and there's that flat specificity that you're yearning for with BEM. It does apply in CUBE as well because everything's done at a global level in CUBE. It's actually beneficial to give yourself that bump inside of a block to just to underpin the whole context of what a block is in CUBE, where it's like it's a specific context. So give yourself that one extra point of specificity, and then you can be comfortable knowing that whatever you define in that block takes precedent. So then the point about using actual element selectors as well, like how that isn't a problem, is what I've seen historically with BEM, because BEM has zero relationship to HTML in terms of the selectors. I've seen some pretty garbage HTML end up in components because of that, where going back to using element selectors sort of enforces structure and enforces a certain type of markup as well, which I think is actually really beneficial. We seem to be straying away from the standards a little bit in the modern web, and that's the sort of thing that can help enforce it, not just for people that are seasoned HTML programmers, also people that don't really understand HTML, because you're actually providing them with rules that help them to write better HTML. A good example of this is I did a tutorial about a progressive disclosure component last year, and what I do with that is I actually use CSS to enforce the disclosure itself. So if the button doesn't have the ARIA pressed attribute on it, the actual disclosure element will just remain open because it's not valid. It's not a valid component. So it's sort of forcing accessibility with the CSS as well by using the specific HTML attributes on it. And I think that's it. Yeah, so that was block, wasn't it? So there's just one last bit then, isn't there?
Yep, so we just have the E for exceptions. And this is one that I'm actually really interested in your approach on.
So an exception is an exceptional circumstance. So one thing, and this is where I started to see problems with BEM, is when you're dealing with finite state. So what I mean by finite state is that a state can only be one thing at any one time. So a good example, when people talk about finite state machines specifically, they use a traffic light as an example. A traffic light can only ever be red, amber, or green. It cannot be in any other way. I know in some countries you can have a bit of overlap, but we'll go over that premise that there is red means stop, amber means get ready to either stop or go, and then green means go. And what you get with BEM is that with modifiers, you could have red, green, and amber all present at the same time, because you could add the modifiers all the time. And especially when JavaScript is adding the modifiers for you, or some other sort of outside influences affecting them, it can get pretty leery pretty quick. And I found this with a really complex UI where we were coming up with some real weird bugs that were getting reported, and the reason is because multiple modifiers are being applied at any one time. So back to exceptions, what I recommend people do with them is to use data attributes instead, because a data attribute enforces finite state. So it's a really handy way of doing it. So say you've got a traffic light component, and you could say data state equals stop. And then you know that data state equals stop means that the component would be red. And then you can say data state equals go, and it'd be green. Stop and go can never be together. They can never happen at the same time. So an exception enforces that state. And now that we work in very sort of state-driven context, it's really helpful to work like that with CSS, and it sort of quells the reason to even use CSS in JS as well, because you're using the web platform to do your job for you. It gives us all these tools for free, so it's good to use them to do what we need to do. And yeah, it's really handy, and the exceptions shouldn't really come across very often either. So that's why they're really far down the pecking order with Cube right at the end.
The last thing that I think is really interesting when I got to the part is on the groupings.
Oh yeah, oh man,
I'd be curious how that's being received. But for me, that was like when I saw it at first, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then it's like, well, yeah, that I as you say in it, like it's an invalid thing, but let's take advantage of CSS, and it just, if it doesn't know what it is, it just skip over it, and it doesn't cause any harm, and it gives us visual clues. So I thought that was a nice creative sort of approach, and when I said it, you seemed to have a certain reaction. So I don't, is that had a bit of a backlash as well?
My inbox, yeah. I mean, it's even before Cube. Like, I've been doing the grouping thing for a few years, and I get so many questions from people saying, what's with these square brackets? I really don't understand it. And actually, you'll notice if you read through the Cube article, in the middle of it, I have to acknowledge the square brackets and lead people down to the end of the article where I talk about them, because people weren't making it to the end of the article. They were just immediately going in the middle of the article, going, right, open Twitter, @anxiousdor, what's with these square brackets? And every single time, we're like, if you actually finish the article, I explained why I do it, and it is a grouping mechanism. So the whole idea is that there's everything that's related to each other should fit within the square brackets. And like you said, HTML will just ignore them, because HTML is smart enough to just ignore what it doesn't understand. CSS is exactly the same, both really forgiving languages, and they'll just keep running through doing what they do. So then what you can do inside of the square brackets is, what I'd do is like any block rules in there, and then I'd add any utilities, maybe another block. So say you got a card, you might also have, I don't know, a box, which is another block. You put them in two separate little groups like that, put your utilities in another group, and then that, when someone comes to look at that element in the HTML, they can immediately see that there's separate parts of the methodology dealing with that element for you. And you can see, oh yeah, that's the block style, that's the utility. Cool, right, I know what's going on now. Whereas if you just had a long string of classes inside of a class attribute, then it might take you a few seconds to just say, what's going on here? Or the thing that always terrifies me is that a junior might come into it and go, I don't want to touch this because I'm terrified of it, which I've seen in the past with Tailwind projects. The whole idea of writing as little CSS as possible is really cool, and I actually like Tailwind for prototyping especially. I think it's brilliant. The problem is, though, is that when you've got quite a complex UI, there's a hell of a lot of classes on an element, and that can be terrifying for someone who's already quite nervous about touching production code anyway. Whereas what I'm trying to achieve with the grouping is to say, look, don't worry about it. These are all semi-related to each other. So if you touch this group, you're only going to affect that group of properties, and that's it.
Oh, so yeah, I think that's more or less wrapped up everything that I had,
cool.
all the questions I had about it. So I just want to say thanks, first of all, so much for your time. Last thing, I guess, just if you have any advice, if somebody else thinks this is really cool, or even for me, I want to start diving into it a lot more. Do you have any advice for people that are first getting started, other than reading the blog post and the documentation that you've started working on?
Yeah, so what I'm going to start releasing soon is some example content. So I'm working on something now, which is actually probably not what you'd expect with Cube, is how to use Cube to do art direction. And I'm doing that, a video for that. And I'm also working on a few other examples of Cube. I think one thing I'd recommend is to sort of come up with a simple layout, a simple context. So the main example on Cube is there's like a hero element and 3 cards. Try and build it using the methodology. So try and build that and you could essentially use that blog post as a tutorial of how to do it. And then go from there, really. Try and expand it. I've heard from some people that have tried to use Cube in existing projects, which is great, because that's what it's designed to be able to do as well, is to sort of be an enhancement to a project. And then, of course, like I've got a course on 11, which about 60% of it is building out a wicked front end with Cube. So obviously you could go and do that as well, and that'd be awesome. But other than that, it's just keep playing with it and get in touch and give me feedback as well. There's a tracker in GitHub. I really want to hear what people think of it and ideas and issues that they might have come across, because I want Cube to be an ever evolving project that hopefully helps people write good CSS.
Fantastic. I'll definitely put a link down in the description for your 11T course.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And is there anything, what else? Obviously, you're busy with Cube. You just had your course release. Is there anywhere else people can follow what you're up to?
Well, if you go on to Piccadilly, there's always stuff happening on there. The latter half of this year is all CSS for me now. I've doing the 11T stuff was a bit of a interjection to what I'm normally known for, which is CSS. So very much on that. Obviously, every layout will always be tweaked on. I'm going to do some work on that too this year. And but yeah, I'm just starting a new course now, CSS from scratch, which is exactly what it says in the tin. We're going to learn CSS from absolutely nothing, no knowledge required whatsoever, and then by the end of it, you should be pretty confident writing CSS. So that's the aim, and hopefully I can pull my finger out and get on with it.
Oh, that's fantastic. So yeah, I just want to say once again, thank you so much for your
Oh,
time
no worries.
and for joining
Thank
me
you
here.
for having me. Yeah.
And yeah, I'm excited to start diving into it a little bit and trying it out.
Cool. Cheers, Kevin.
Cheers. And I just want to say once again, a big thank you to Andy for coming and having that chat with me. It was really, really awesome for him to share his time with me like that. I really enjoyed the interview. It was a lot of fun. I also just don't forget, there's all those links down below that you can jump into for all the stuff that he's up to. Again, he has his Piccadilly with lots of really good resources there. He just put up a blog post after our interview that takes a deep dive into building a layout with Cube. So definitely, if you want to really see how it works and how the different parts of it come together, that blog post is definitely worth checking out. So thank you very much for watching this. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I had talking with Andy. A really big thank you to all my patrons for helping support everything I do here. You guys mean the world to me. Thank you so much for your support. It is absolutely amazing. And of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.